Hello and welcome to the Beyond Podcast. And today we're going to be continuing a series of chats I've been having with various people who've been working on early modern women writers. Specifically, today we're talking about the writer of The Tragedy of Mariam. We'll be talking about Elizabeth Kolkovich and talking with people who've been doing considerably more background work on Mariam than we have so far in detail. We've done an awful lot of work on the play within the podcast with our full cast audio adaptation, and we are increasingly chatting to more people about such things. But hopefully today we're going to be diving a little bit more into the background and also the methods by which we all go out there and find out about early modern dramatists who are sometimes not the obvious ones that we think of or sometimes forget are there. So to discuss The Tragedy of Mariam and a documentary about Mariam is these wonderful people who are going to introduce themselves now. So my three whole wonderful guests. Who are you and what is your purpose in life?
My name is Sarah Neville. I am an associate professor at Ohio State University in English and theater, and I am the founder and creative director of Lord Denney's Players, which is a theater company at OSU that investigates intersections of textual criticism and performance.
And I am Elizabeth Kolkovich. I am also an associate professor of English at Ohio State. And I was the director of Looking for Mariam 1613, which was an absolute joy to work on.
I'm Tamar Mohadeen. I'm a PhD candidate in the English department at Ohio State University. My area of expertise includes early modern women writers and intersectionality of history of science and book history.
Let's start with Sarah. You're talking about your area of work with your players, and which I think is the sort of the starting point for where we are with the work you've been doing recently. How did that come about, and what sort of work have you been doing with them?
So I started the company when I arrived at OSU in 2014. We were fortunate that the English department at that time had Richard Dutton in it, who had received a grant to put on a performance of a play. And Richard said, I don't really know what to do with this, but you do. And that had been some of my background. So he handed me this opportunity. What I realized that we could do with that is investigate further some of the things that don't often get performed. In particular, we could start performing the earlier texts of plays that are known as bad quartos. And so LDP has done a lot of those bad quartos over the years. And in 2020, fall of 2020, I was supposed to direct a production of the most famous of the bad quartos, and it was impossible because of COVID-19. And so instead of putting on a live performance, I realized we could sort of lean into the challenges of our Zoom-fueled moment and do a documentary film about the textual problems. Instead of just showing a performance, we could actually bring in scholars from around the world in order to put on a documentary film. And what was great about that Lord Denney's Players production of film is that we were able to bring students. I had students who were all over the United States at that moment because of the way that the university had gone online. And Elizabeth and I had conversations later about how this could provide a model for future kinds of teaching. Lord Denney's Players productions are always invested in the work of undergraduates, bringing the textual problems, the critical problems that scholars grapple with to the undergraduate classroom so that undergraduates themselves can become experts in this process. And Elizabeth, as an expert in early modern women, I had already, in my other capacity for work, I am the coordinating editor of the Digital Renaissance editions. And I had been hounding Elizabeth for some time to edit Tragedy of Mariam for us. And these two possibilities dovetailed quite nicely. And that's when we realized that we could do something productive with undergraduates with Lord Denney's Players in a documentary form with The Tragedy of Mariam as well.
Which I think leads us nicely to Elizabeth in terms of pulling something like this together, and it appears to be a very much a collaborative process and pulling lots of different threads. So how did I really should mention I haven't explicitly said it so far. This documentary is available on YouTube now. There will be an explicit plug to this towards the end of the actual episode, but I think we should mention now that you can always pause now if you like and go away, watch the documentary, and come back again. Then you'll have a better context for what we're talking about. Or finish listening to this, watch the documentary, come back, listen to this again. You can do these things in a loop. It's the great thing about the digital world. Anyway, sorry, Elizabeth, tell us how did you start marshalling your forces?
Well, I did always want it to be a collaborative project, and there were two main reasons for that. One was practical. Although I have been involved in theater in many capacities in the past, I had never directed a show myself. So I knew that I wanted good people around me who could help me do this. And I had never done a documentary. I've watched a lot of documentaries, but I had never made a documentary myself. So again, I needed people around me who could help me, make it better. The second reason is more a kind of theoretical one, or an idea that I had for what I wanted to do, based very much on Lord Denney's Players' mission to make undergraduates involved in a way that they learn things all along the way. And I wanted my documentary to do that too. So I taught a course on the Tragedy of Mariam in the spring semester at Ohio State. And the students in that course served as the documentary's writers and production team. And then meanwhile, Tamara and I held auditions, and then once we selected a cast, rehearsals in the evenings, and we performed scenes from the play. So I had both things going at the same time: the course, which was about making the documentary, and the production, which was about performing parts from the play. And it was a really amazing experience to be able to do those two things at the same time and explore this play from so many different angles. And I think that's what made it an incredibly rich experience for me, for my students, and for the actors.
Yes. So, Tamara, you were involved in this process as well. I mean, how does it work coordinating so many different strands? I mean, it's something I'm very familiar with. The work we do is we're always reading plays, we're always working on plays, we're always developing and discussing with other people. It can be a bit of a minefield, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I think Elizabeth did a good job of managing the student groups in the classroom and us in the back end doing the rehearsals. So what we would do is we put a full on schedule, and it honestly was a very tight schedule. We didn't have a lot of weeks because we were planning to make the documentary out in April. So we had this intense rehearsals back to back. But at the same time, as Elizabeth was saying, the course was taking place, and every single group that she had in the classroom was working on a specific part of the documentary. And that helped us at the same time when we were talking during the rehearsals with the actors, what they're going to wear, costumes. Elizabeth would go back and report to her students, and she would share also the links to the rehearsals with the students, so they can also access that and see parts of the documentary that they can pull out and what they want to include in each part of the documentary. So I think a lot of it had to do with Elizabeth trying to balance these. And mostly when it comes to the actors, I was the point of contact if they wanted to send me any emails, and I'll try to resolve anything before I, reach out to Elizabeth.
Yeah, it's this lovely sort of feedback loop that you've got there. If all the information is accessible, people are interacting with each other with work that's happening in a separate space. And what sort of things are then coming out of the student work there or on the plays? And because I know you're also interviewing academics and other people who've interacted with the play on a much more formal level, but is there a qualitative difference about what's coming in at the sharp end, as it were, as opposed to people who've been working on it for a great period of time? I don't know who wants to answer that, by the way. I'm just throwing this out to anyone who wants to jump in.
Well, I will say that the students fairly quickly became experts on the play. We read it right away, the first full week of class, and they knew they were going to be working on it intensely, so they paid close attention. They had a lot of questions, and we read a lot of scholarship together, and I gave them an overview of some things that we didn't read. So it really didn't take very many weeks for them to feel very comfortable with the play. And one thing that came out of that kind of feedback loop you were discussing that was really great was ended up being kind of a central focus on a very minor character named Grafina. She appears just in one scene and has one speech, although it's quite a long speech, as are many of the speeches in the play. And scholars have talked about her somewhat in the past for sure. But what happened in our case was Grafina was played by an undergraduate student who was in my course. So she was in the class and an actor. And part of my students' interest in Grafina definitely was that this actor, whose name is Vivian, was always there in class. And so we could talk about her character and ask her questions, and she could explain how her work in the course led her to think more about this minor character. And I think my students also liked that we presented in our documentary, in our performance, the entire speech of Grafina. That's the only character that I didn't cut at all. All the other characters, I cut several lines, and so we were able to look at Grafina more fully in some ways than other characters. And my students loved that. And they loved digging deeply into the one speech. So that was just one example of how having a production and a class going at the same time created a really kind of serendipitous moment that we were able to analyze.
And so you're primarily, you were looking at the play sort of in scenes and units. Do you have any sort of wider thoughts about the play, as a full performance and not necessarily uncut? I mean, there are always good reasons to trim early modern drama. But yeah, in terms of even looking at it in small pieces, you can imagine it as a wider thing. Again, open to anyone who wants to leap in.
Absolutely. I'll say a couple of things, and I'd love to hear what Tamara has to say about this because she was there every step of the way with me. So the first thing we did at the very beginning of the semester we were working on this play is that Tamara and I and two other actors got together on Zoom and read the entire play aloud. We had to take multiple roles, obviously, per person, but that taught us a lot about the play. And it was even longer than we expected. How long was it, Tamara? It was like over 3 hours, I think, to read the whole thing aloud. And we were able to notice moments that seemed more stagnant and moments that seemed more exciting, just read aloud. And we noticed lots of things. Then I cut the play substantially, but still as a full play. So I cut parts of scenes, but there was at least part of every scene present. And that's when we got together with all of the actors once the production was cast, and we read that second version all aloud together. And that was also incredibly useful. So each of the actors got to see a fuller trajectory of their character. We got to see how several themes emerged for us. And then based on that reading and my conversations with my students, that's when I cut the text down to individual scenes. So we already sort of had a sense of some major themes that we saw in the play that we wanted to highlight and why we chose the scenes we did. So Tamara, for you, what did you... Tamara also, I should say, had already written a dissertation chapter on the Tragedy of Mariam. So she came into it with her own arguments. She was very good about letting me cut some of the scenes that were actually really important to her dissertation. So I'm sure you learned different things from that different cut.
So one of the things I think when we decided to cut the documentary into specific parts and specific themes, what helped also each specific group is interviewing the scholars. So it's not just Elizabeth interviewing all the scholars. It's actually in the documentary, they're the students who decided to pick one or two scholars to interview for that specific theme, whether it's religion, gender, and race. And after they did that, And after they saw the rehearsals, they decided to take parts of which scenes or specific clips from scenes that they want to include to build on what the scholars and the researchers have said about the play. And I think that's what made also the documentary even more fruitful, these conversations that the students can have. And honestly, there's not, again, we had to pick and choose what we want to include, what the scholarship has said, the scholars and the questions, but the students asked amazing questions. And they were very informative. They read the play by heart, they know it, and then that's how they came up with these questions. And at the same time, this is, I think, what helped us pull everything together at the end. And every single group also worked on the narrative, the narration for the documentary. And I think that helped as a whole for all the students to come in and do the documentary successfully.
And if I can just jump in here, this is part of the Lord Denney's players' mandate that the productions are coming out of classroom work. So we have put on multiple productions of this type where students are making decisions about the performance, whether live performance in a theater or performance on film, which is our post-pandemic development, because literary criticism and performance, they're responsive to one another. They have a kind of recursive relationship. As we know, scholars see things in performance and then it shifts the way they write about a play, but also directors will often reach for scholarship in order to help illuminate some of the work that they're doing. The goal of Lord Denney's players' performances and their productions is to kind of lift the veil of that critical work that academics do to smooth out play text in production, to give the public a sense of what is going on in the machinery. And so the documentary gave students a really explicit opportunity to do this work, to kind of show how the literary criticism sausage gets made, as it were.
Yeah, and it's structurally a very interesting play. I think we should also we should talk about the play a little bit. And in terms of the potential challenges and advantages to the text as it is written and as it could be adjusted. I mean, there are lots of little potential pitfalls. There are potential issues. There are obviously some absolutely fantastic bits. I love it as a play overall. Are there any bits that maybe you trimmed out that you I mean, I think tomorrow I've got a sense that there were some bits you may have regretted losing. But yeah, are there bits that you regret losing or losing the focus on, or bits that you're very happy that they would disappear from, maybe from a performance, but maybe kept for documentary purposes? Because there are certainly several areas in the text where you're going, that is a very interesting thing for me to discuss. That is not necessarily the thing I want to watch on a stage. And there are all sorts of elements in the play that might throw up. Again, a very general question that anyone could leap in on. It's not even really a question, is it? It's more a statement. Yeah, any thoughts? Or things you missed or didn't miss in that process of narrowing down?
And I think I missed everything that we didn't put in. I think that everything in the play has value, but one scene in particular that would be incredibly fun to direct in live theater, or filmed where actors are actually in the same room, is a sword fight in the middle of the play. And the versions I've seen, the productions I've seen of Tragedy of Mariam do have a great deal of fun with that scene. But I cut that one for a couple of reasons. One is that we ended up cutting one of the characters who's in that scene because we had such a abbreviated timeline and we had really fantastic actors, but I didn't want to double any parts. So we had to cut the cast down too for time constraints and personnel constraints. And
I think we should can we just pause for a second? I think one of the things we haven't explained is that this whole documentary needed to, from start to finish, be completed in 14 weeks. And so because it had to follow along the OSU semester system, and so the constraints of what could be done were really governed by how much time students had in the classroom to complete work, what is a reasonable amount of work for a 3-credit hour class, and what ultimately could be completed in 14 weeks. And that does impact the way that Elizabeth and Tamara had to make their choices.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I will also say that Sarah and I spent a lot of time at the beginning of the semester and right before the semester began figuring out the schedule, exactly what we could do and couldn't do, how we would organize our time. And then with Tamara, she and I spent a lot of time up front too, figuring out what was reasonable. So that definitely, practical concerns governed a lot of what we did. But one thing that I guess I didn't miss in terms of what we cut is that some of the very, very long speeches, you talked about limitations and obstacles for this play, and it is a great play, but wow, some of those speeches are incredibly long. When we read the whole thing aloud, one of the actors said, "This verse is relentless," because it's all written as poetry, and the actors found some of it very difficult to memorize. And so sometimes those really long soliloquies or monologues, when we cut them down, I didn't actually miss some of the extra stuff. And so that's a case in which I think that a future director could cut quite a bit of individual speeches while still retaining the gist and the mood and the feeling of the piece.
It's a very specific challenge with neoclassical drama, is that question of how much focus on almost storytelling rather than drama that is going on in a text, and sometimes it's a matter of having the right audience for that. I'm always actually surprised by how much an audience sometimes will take from a very intense, never-ending bit of discourse like that. But sometimes, obviously, depending on your audience, they might absolutely reject it, and it's a matter of trying to decide which battle that you want to fight at any particular moment.
This might be a moment where the fact that this is written to be a closet drama, this is a text that is written to be read, where the tolerance for that neoclassicism is, I think, even higher than it is in something that was written to be specifically performed for an audience. You have a lot of opportunity to just keep going. I think Carrie had a lot of opportunity to keep going, knowing that someone could just read above or below, as opposed to having to hear it the whole time. And so this was a great moment, I think, for showing that tension between listening and reading.
And it is interesting comparing it with some other neoclassical authors who really aren't interested in performance. I think this one is on a balancing point of, there are reasonable propositions that it was performed in some fashion, and it was designed on some level to be performed. Whereas you can read something like by William Alexander, for example, where you're sitting there, or Fulk Greville, where you're going, no, you have no interest in this being staged in front of an actual series of human beings, because this is literally unrelenting, as opposed to something that is chunky, shall we say. So you delve also not only into the play itself, which we obviously think is fabulous, and into Elizabeth Carey herself and her life, and in terms of how your interactions with quite a well-documented life as well, how that influences how you're thinking about the play, or how your students are thinking about the play, and then also how do you present that in the documentary itself. So yes, Elizabeth Carey, how did that journey progress?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's one of the most detailed debates that my students and I had, was how to present Elizabeth Carey's biography in the documentary. And that's because when we started our project, the students wanted to know who this writer was. I had 16 students in the class, and one had read the play with me before in a class a couple of years ago. Other than that, the other 15 had never heard of the play, let alone read it, and they'd never heard of Elizabeth Carey. So they wanted to know all of the basics. They wanted to know how this play came about, when it was published, and who this woman was. And early in the semester, we read some different pieces about her biography. And then we invited into our class, again, very early, two scholars, Laura Dodds and Michelle Dowd, and they collaborate together on work on women writers. And so I wanted to bring them in at the beginning of a collaborative project to kind of talk to my students about how to do collaboration, as well as to talk about what they've published on the Tragedy of Mariam. And all my students wanted to ask about for a while was the biography of Carey, because we had just read about that. But these particular scholars are interested in moving away from a biographical reading and doing other kinds of analysis of this play. And so it was a very funny moment where the students realized that different scholars approach things differently. And so we were able to talk about how one play, you can approach it in a variety of ways. And I think a lot of my students had never quite realized that before. And so that was really fruitful. So then we ended up kind of reading the history of the scholarship on the play and understanding that in the early 80s and 90s, when people were first writing about this play, biographical readings led the way. That was kind of feminist scholars into this play, was thinking about Carey's life, specifically that a couple decades after Carey wrote the play, she ended up converting to Catholicism and separating from her husband. And so then you have a play very much about marriage and divorce, and in various ways about religion. And my students and I completely understood why it was tempting to tie together the life and the work. So we had a lot of discussions about, what do we do? Do we lead the documentary with the biography? Will that encourage people to see the play through that lens? But if we don't lead with biography, aren't general viewers going to wonder who this woman was? So we hope we did a little of both in showing people who she is, but also saying that, hey, if the biography helps you find a window into the play, great. But maybe also keep in mind that a lot of the really interesting kind of scandalous stuff about Carey's life ended up happening pretty far after we think she wrote the play. So we can keep it in mind, and maybe she had some of those hints of ideas about marriage and divorce and religion, but there are a variety of other ways that we can approach the play. And that's why I like, and this structure was 100% Sarah's suggestion. She said, divide the documentary into thematic chunks, so that we divided students into groups, and each group took on a different kind of theme in the play. And so we were able to approach it from a variety of angles.
I think, is this big question about the biographical approach. I mean, which can be very helpful, certainly for artists, when approaching text like this. It's interesting that the temptation with, for example, an earlier play by a woman, Lady Lumley's translation of Iphigenia, the temptation there is almost overwhelming. To follow a biographical route, whereas with Carey it is that different balancing act because of the chronology. What I think is interesting is just actually what that is saying about women in society at the time. These questions of divorce, and that is one of the fascinating things about what this play is doing, is that you have a character who does this absolutely wonderful speech about, wouldn't it be great if I had the power to divorce? Oh, well, I'll just have to murder my husband then. And within a second does this flip, which is such a dramatically powerful moment in the play, and is able to demonstrate characters, so many female characters, who are not necessarily great people, who have a life and a development that makes it very, very interesting. I'm just rambling now, so it's fine. But all of the characters have these questions and these journeys, and even the male characters as well. This question with Constabarus, who I've always had a sort of love-hate relationship with, because I kind of can't stand him. but then he's genuinely lost about these concepts of just, you know, what you're allowed to have a life as well. No, that's not how our system works, and he's genuinely very confused.
But this is an interesting.
Sorry,
If
I
I
am
can
just rambling, but do carry on.
so I think one of the fascinating things about works written by women is because relatively there are so few of them in comparison to their male counterparts, that there is a tendency to go biographical because there is this dearth of sort of general knowing, and we want to know more. We absolutely want to know more about women in the period. And for a lot of our scholarship, our understanding of women in the period comes from fictional characters written by male authors. And what the Tragedy of Mariam brings up is the opportunity to experience female characters written by women, who do things like talk about divorce and how great divorce would be, and who put that inequality right at the top of the conversations that they're having, or the conversations about beauty that underwrite so many of the female conversations in this play, about how Miriam buys into her own beauty as something that she can cash out on in various ways, and use as her source of her power, so that beauty and virtue can sort of stand in for one another. We see these conversations happening throughout Renaissance drama in various ways, right? I'm thinking of like Webster, for example. Webster's plays where they come up a lot, but it's very different to have a female author putting forward these kinds of arguments about the concerns that women can have. And as you note about Constabaris, it's also fascinating to have a female author write about men and some of the constraints, or perhaps in Constabaris's case, the willful blindnesses or idiocies or ideologies that underwrite masculinity, that it gives us a different chance to think through some of these issues from a historical and critical perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will add that my students and I decided that if we want to take a biographical approach to the Tragedy of Mariam, the one that we prefer is to think of the fact that we believe that Carrie was a teenager when she wrote the play, newly married, probably not living with her husband at that time. And if we believe the biography that was written about her by one or two of her daughters after she died, then we see her, Elizabeth Carey, as a kind of scholar, a very knowledgeable and very avid reader. And my students were really taken with that. They liked that idea of a woman writer who is incredibly smart and knowledgeable, bringing together several things that she had read and thinking through different kinds of theoretical debates, like about divorce. And that the speech by Salome about divorce was hands down the favorite of everybody's, the actors, the students, us. And they're a part of the documentary that we ended up not using, but that it was super fun, is we asked most people we interviewed if they were Team Salome or Team Mariam. And, most of the time, especially the scholars, they would laugh and say, well, I can't choose between the two of them. And they both have good and bad qualities. But then when we pushed them to it, something like 75 to 80% of the people said Salome. She's just so fun. We know she's the villain, but she's so fun. And especially, I think, for 21st century women. And I have to say that most of the scholars who've written about this play are women. Most of the people, not all, but many of the people who have directed the play are women. So a lot of the people that we interviewed were also women. So a lot of them said, from the perspective of a 21st century woman, some of the things Salome is saying, I just want to cheer along. And that's great. But another thing that came out of our production and documentary making that I found fascinating is that my students and the actors, especially the actor who played Mariam, did not like Mariam very much as a character. And you'll see that in the documentary that she talks about it, and other people do too. Before I dug into the play this deeply, I think I had a kind of surface level reading of Mariam. She says terribly racist things to Salome. She clearly uses the language of her time. As Sarah was saying earlier, she believes that her beauty and her chastity pretty much give her carte blanche to do whatever she wants. But I still thought of her as this hero of the play. It's called The Tragedy of Mariam. Everybody seems to admire her for the most part. But when we really dug into her character, I understand why. She's much more complicated than I realized.
I mean, yes, especially as the play opens, we meet her mother straight away, who is if we're talking about the problems of race in the play, she's got an unbelievably problematic mother, and it's like Mariam isn't as bad as her mother, but she does seem to have internalized a lot of that. But so much of the play is couched on areas of race, as well as descent and who's in charge of the kingdom and those kind of lineal descents. But everybody is framing their relationships to each other, or almost everybody is on that sort of level. Constabaros's little contretemps, so much of that is they're leveling racial epithets at each other as well. And so, yeah, I when I think about Mariam, is that yes, that she has internalized so many of these structures that are around her. And I keep thinking about just the court of the early 17th century, of what's going on in court masques, and the way that this is starting to present itself in culture, the culture that Elizabeth Carey would be very much involved with on some level, and that leads to all sorts of questions about what you then present on a stage as well, because it's not hard to trim back Mariam's mother, because she does talk rather a lot, and the play does have sort of an exposition problem with that first act. You kind of need to already know who everybody is before they start speaking. It is one of those elements in performance that you kind of go, I'm not quite sure who these people, because they're all related, and we need to know how they're all related almost before anything happens in the play.
Yeah, and this is why Zoom ended up being such a great medium for exploring closet drama. We ended up cutting Alexandra entirely, and that is something that I did regret a little toward the end, because toward the end of our documentary making, because I would have liked to allow viewers to think about how Alexandra, Mariam's mother, might have influenced her. And we didn't have that. So without that, you have no idea where Mariam gets her language and her ideas. Anyway, we could give little captions, little lines saying who people were, which characters were speaking when they start speaking. So we just were able to kind of move right around that problem. And if you watch the documentary, you'll notice that we never have a scene with more than 2 actors. And that was purposeful too. We wanted to use the medium of Zoom to explore how the play really allows us to think about characters' interiority in a way that seemed to us rather exceptional when compared to commercial drama that my students were used to reading. So that was a really fun thing to do, to think about how this 21st century platform could maybe give us insight into the kinds of performances that a closet drama, a drama meant for reading, could enable.
Yeah.
I just want to tap into something. While we couldn't cast all the characters, and we did miss Alexandra, I think one of the things that we were trying to do in the documentary is that a lot of the conversation in the documentary hopefully will help teachers use the documentary as a way to explore these questions even more. And that is, okay, Alexandra was not mentioned in the documentary, but we watched it. What can we come up with as students? And I think that's what I liked about the documentary. We couldn't include all of them, but we mentioned them, and hopefully that would become as a tool, a teaching tool, to have these conversations even more expanded with the students. And that could be, like, we focused on Doris, Grafina, Mariam, and Salome, but Alexandra can easily fit in, especially if you go back and read the exposition and that specific scene with her mom.
Yeah, and this is the advantage of putting things like this out into the digital world. It's a route in, as you were just saying there, and that's what we're very much interested in, a series of different routes in the different pathways that can get you into reading the play and going, yes, I can lock into what's going on, and just a basic understanding of what the plot is doing, even if you aren't introduced to every single character, is incredibly useful. But with any of these early modern plays, is that they have a whole series of barriers to do with just day-to-day language that they use, extremely explicitly strange language that they use, as well as problematic content, all of which are saying, go away, don't. I mean, if you just look at Mariam on the page, it is a scary text.
It's true.
And it doesn't need to be. I mean, it's not even an excessively long play. The problem with tragedies is when reading them, people do tend to slow down. I've got longer scripts for comedies that run shorter than this. I'm always fascinated by how plays move at different speeds. But this is not actually, for a tragedy, actually very long. It is on the lower end of the spectrum, which I suppose at least is one advantage for it, is that it shouldn't take that much time out of it.
But that's where that question of dialogue comes in, right? Because if this is a speechy play, and comedies are chatty, and so you have a lot of opportunities for the more interaction between the characters. I think that the more speed gets, the speedier the play ends up getting. Because when you're dealing with so much heavy exposition, especially in those early scenes, all you can really do is slow down to ensure that the audience can follow along. These details matter. Let me tell you why they matter. But that ends up creating that sort of slow feedback loop that just draws out this process. And I think this happens in tragedies writ large. But the real challenge, I think, for Mariam is that you need all that exposition, because this is a play that follows the unities. This is a play, if all of this action is going to happen in one day, but really it's because all of this other stuff, there's all this background that you need to know in order to enable the unities to function.
Yes.
And that's really what's doing it.
They've killed a lot of family members prior to the play coming up, and you need to know who their names are. Otherwise, a lot of that impact is going to be lost. That central opening dilemma from Mariam of why am I feeling these emotions for this guy who's killed this, and what is the right direction I should be traveling in?
Yeah, and my students were really fascinated by Carrie's structure of her plot. And one thing that they loved when they first read the play was that Carrie withholds some key information until the fourth act. And we had a lot of discussion that, besides biographical reading, this was the other area that my students and I spent a lot of time debating, is whether we give the entire plot up front in the documentary or whether we unfold the documentary kind of according to the plot. And we voted, and it was very close, but we decided that the majority would rule, and we went with withholding information, sort of like Carrie does. So we ended up, my idea was I was just going to sort of give a brief plot summary at the beginning, and I gave that to my students, and they were like, But then we rob new viewers from the wonderful experience of discovering what is really going on. And so we ended up sort of following the trajectory of the play as we prepared the documentary. And I also, my students told me that whenever I talk about it, I should also not spoil the ending. So I think we've done a good job so far not doing that here.
Yeah. I'm so tempted just to leap in. No, I won't. It's all right.
That's fine. Also.
But yes, yes, because in a sense, what the first three acts are doing is they're developing the question of what happens in a power vacuum. When Herod is taken off the table and everybody else is going, right, what do I do now? And the only person who really grabs the nettle on that is Salome, who really, everybody else talks about what do we do now and where are we now, and some people make minor moves, but Salome is the only one who goes, okay, I see an opportunity here. to change where my life at least is going. And obviously, plans change when events occur. We are running out of time, alas. But I do want to, first of all, ask someone to do an official plug for the documentary. Where is it? How can it be found? And why should our wonderful listeners go to it?
The documentary is called Looking for Mariam 1613, and it is freely available at YouTube. Very easy to find. All you have to do is search Looking for Mariam 1613. It also lives at the Ohio State University English Department YouTube channel.
Links will be in the show description if you cannot find it in a search engine. And now, final thoughts from the room, which very much, if you could stage Mariam tomorrow, what would you do with it? Let's throw that one out there. I'll go to Tamara first because I'm cruel.
If I could stage it tomorrow, yeah, I wouldn't feel bad about cutting some speeches, to be honest. And I would definitely include the sword fight. And I would think. I would love to have more, I don't know, decoration, make the stage more like I don't know. I would love to make it embody what Elizabeth Carey would have thought, which I don't know what she would have thought, but I would try my best to think about how she would staged it if she wanted to. So yeah.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, I would love to see a version on a live stage of that second script that Tamara and I cut and put together, which is the whole play, but the whole thing cut down a bit with all of the characters cast. And I would love to see how that would work. I would love to do a modern dress, lively production with young actors, in a kind of university setting, perhaps. But the other thing I'll say is that I would really love to see this play put on more by professional companies.
That's my answer. I would like to see Julie Taymor do this and set it in space, where they're all in Mars. Tragedy of Mariam in space. Come on, I think it could happen if we could just get the backers.
Yeah.
I think we can start lobbying for that now.
Laura Denney's Player's next production, which is going to be performed November 21st to 23rd in a theater in downtown Columbus, is John Fletcher's Tragi-comedy, The Faithful Shepherdess. So we are going to see whether or not this play, which I think is a ribald send-up of classical pastoral, justified its famous failure on the Renaissance stage. I hope we have a more successful run than that, but that is going to be Lord Denney's Player's next project, and I cannot wait.
Me neither.
Same.
Well, thank you very much, all my wonderful guests, for being wonderful. There will be more on Mariam going forward, I'm sure, from us and other outlets. All remains to thank the wonderful guests for being wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Bye.